what is the inconsistency? The left says, this is what they tell us. They say we are against racism. We are against racial hatred. We are against racial discrimination, racial prejudice. We are against inequality. That is their purported message. Those are their stated values. And so what the conservatives like to do is turn it around and say, oh, no, no, no. If you're against racial prejudice, well, actually, you started the KKK or you started the Nazis. In other words, many conservatives take them at their word. And they say, this is so confusing. You say one thing, but you do another. You must not have your head on straight, liberal. If you were really that liberal, you'd be on my team. And they say this like they're proud. Oh look, I just figured something out you didn't know. Look, if you were really liberal, you would... But the stated values are a lie, obviously. If the left cared about racial hatred, racism, that kind of thing, they wouldn't allow that. If the left was against all of that, they wouldn't allow that on their platform. They wouldn't allow that to stay up. It wouldn't be encouraged. It wouldn't be chic. It wouldn't be popular. So that's not true then. What we find is that what they're saying does not adequately describe or reflect their actual values. It's a stated value, but it's not an actual value. So that inconsistency does not tell us that they're confused or they're dumb or they don't really know what they're talking about. No, 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 no. There is consistency. People are consistent and logical. We just have to find out what they really mean when they say they're against racial hatred. What they mean when they say they're against racism or they're for diversity is actually not any of those things. If they were against racism, they wouldn't tolerate that. And if they were for diversity, they wouldn't want the uniform, monolithic thought and monolithic communities within ethnic groups. They wouldn't want that. So the real actual goal is to take down white men. That's what it really is at the end of the day. When they say we're against racism and we're against Nazis, what does that mean? We're against white men. And that's not to say, oh, all white men are racist. It means that that is the stigma, that is the tool, that is the rhetorical mechanism by which they can say, white people, shut up. Racism is the cardinal sin, and who are the only people capable of committing it? White men. Have you ever heard a black person get called a racist? Nope. Never happened. Have you ever heard an Asian get called a racist? I've never seen it. Please let me know. Have you ever seen an Hispanic person get called a racist? I've seen many examples of racial prejudice on the part of Mexicans. George Lopez said that Mexicans think black people are lazy. He didn't get called a racist for it. Do we see on his Wikipedia page a racist Mexican supremacist George Lopez? No, of course not. We don't see it. That's why they call it reverse racism when somebody's prejudiced against a white person. Because, and what does that tell you when they say reverse racism is against a white person? It tells you that racism can only go in one direction, from white to others. And so what they're really doing when they say we're against racism, we're against racial hatred, that's the most important thing, is we're saying that we are defining our worldview. Our axiomatic, paradigmatic worldview is defined in opposition to white men. Because if their whole value system is based on fighting racism, and only one group of people is not protected under that definition, which would be straight, white, cisgender men, well then what is really going on there? What is really the crusade? Is it to end racial hatred, or is it to end white people? And so we see the systemic hatred, we see the censorship of people who bring attention to this. And then what we see after that is something which is a little bit more troubling. It's not troubling now. I'm preparing to get the whiteboard out here. I was looking for it for a moment. What's really troubling about this is not a big deal now. You might say, oh, so what? So what? You know, people are saying anti-white things. The reason we tolerate that is because, well, we are in the majority. 67% of the country is white. At least now it is, right? 67% of the country is white, and most of the congressmen are white, and most of the business owners are white. And so therefore, what we say is that, well, this anti-white stuff doesn't really bother us. It's not really bad, or hey, maybe even it's a little bit justified because we are in power, and so we can take it, basically. The argument goes that, well, how we can support this inconsistency is that white people are powerful, and therefore it's not symmetrical. If a white person is racist to a black person, well, black people are poor and victims, and they're in the minority. So if white people are mean to black people, well, that's not fair. That would be like if a really big person started beating up on a really small person. But if a really small person's punching a big person, it's like comical. It's almost funny. It's almost pathetic. It's a joke, right? When that happens. And that's how people look at it now. But we put all these three things together, and it's not a joke. Like Kanye West said, it ain't no joke, though, okay? This is what we see. These are the three big trends. Let me check my audio levels, make sure you can still hear me. Maybe I'll turn up the gain a little bit. These are the big three trends which will lead to a white holocaust. We've got media censorship, which we covered that. We've got the normalization of racial hatred against white people. We took care of that. This is the component that is troubling, the demographic change. What we find is that by 2065, white people in America are going to be 47% of the population. Now, that's based on current projections. We don't know what that could look like by 2065 because immigration is the largest variable. Fertility rates are still a variable. If we keep bringing in 10, 15 million people a year, and that's not counting illegals, or rather 10, 15 million people a decade, not counting illegals, as we are now, it's highly variable what the demographic situation will look like in 2065. If fertility rates keep going down among Hispanics, it might look different too. We don't really know. But present projections say that in 2065, white people will be in the minority. They'll go from 67% to 47%. And that trend will continue for decades and decades. And so in my lifetime, if I live to be 100 years old, by 2098, we could see white people be a very substantially small percentage of the population. In Canada, it's projected that by 2100, white people will be 24% of the population. 24%. Think about that. Okay, so that's where we're headed in America. Globally, by 2100, the white population in the world will be less than 1 billion people. And Africans and Asians will comprise 83% of the population. There'll be about almost 5 billion Africans, almost 5 billion Asians, and less than 1 billion whites all put together. Now, again, you couple that demographic change with media censorship. We're not allowed to talk about the demographic change or this, and you have the normalization of anti-white hatred. This is the perfect storm that leads to what's happening in South Africa. And I use South Africa as the example because people would say otherwise it's a conspiracy theory. If you look at these trends, which are all readily demonstratable, I can show you that all these things are happening. The demographic trends, it's a matter of numbers. It's a matter of mathematics that this inevitably will occur. Already, whites are a minority of births, less than 50%. So this is already happening. Completely factual. I could point to the media censorship. I don't think I really need to. It's on the news. It's on twitter.com. What's happening? What's happening to people like me? What's happening to InfoWars? Anybody who's talking about this. Ben Shapiro doesn't get censored because he doesn't talk about this. He talks about economic systems and straws, and that's why he doesn't get censored. But we do, InfoWars does. And then you have the normalization of anti-white hatred. I just showed you. And it's not even from a third party. It's from the horse's mouth, or it's from, is that the expression? But it's from the people who are saying it. So I could show you all these three trends and say inevitably where this is heading. If you're having this intense, systematic hatred of a certain people, you're not allowed to talk about it, and those people are decreasing in the amount of power, I really don't have to draw you a picture to show you what's going to happen. But anyway, people say, that's kooky stuff, that's white nationalism, that's white supremacy, that's Nazism, that's just kook talk, you're wearing a tinfoil hat. Well, I could show you more evidence, more demonstrable evidence where we're headed when we look at South Africa. Now, people don't know about South Africa. I'm not referring to Southern Africa. I'm referring to the nation of South Africa, which only became independent recently, relatively speaking. And what's happening there is since the end of apartheid, 77,000 white farmers have been killed. South Africa is a majority black nation that under the apartheid regime was ruled by the minority of whites. Since the early 1990s, they got rid of apartheid, and who was put in power was, of course, blacks. If it's a majority black nation and they were being kept under the thumb by a white dictatorship or a white authoritarian government, rather, once they become democratic and liberal, well, the majority black population will elect someone like Nelson Mandela, who was a terrorist who blew up school buses full of white children. So they elect Mandela, they elect the African National Congress to power, which is a political party, and what do they embark on? A project over the past 25 years to drive the predominantly white Dutch-descended farmers, the Boers, from their land. So recently they put into their constitution that it's now okay to take away the land, for the state to come in and take away the land from the white farmers. The African National Congress readily calls, and that's down here, for the killing of the Boer. That's the white hatred. They have a media blackout and this kind of stuff happening. You don't hear about it in Western media. You don't hear about it in South African media. They actually stopped collecting statistics on the farm killings because it was too gruesome. And then you have the killings. This is ultimately what it leads to. And we find that in South Africa presently, let me pull up the exact figure here. Currently, among white farmers in this country, the murder rate, get ready for this, is 156 for every 100,000. 156 for every 100,000. Do you know, and to put that in context, people might say, is that a lot? Is that a little? You know, that's kind of abstract. The highest murder rate in the world by far is in Honduras. By far, by a huge margin, Honduras is the highest out of all countries. Do you know what the murder rate is there? 90 out of 100,000. 90. So the murder rate, 156 per 100,000 for white farmers, is nearly double what it is in the murder capital of the world. And even that country is leading by a very, very high margin. There's nowhere else like it in the world. And that's happening. That's happening in a real place, in real time, and you've never heard about it. Because the same things are going on. The normalization of hatred, the demographic change, and nobody talks about any of it. That's what's happening in the world. And so I think that's enough of the whiteboard. I just wanted to take a moment to really put it all together because I think people tend to compartmentalize. They tend to see it as a free speech issue in and of itself. And it's really not a very coherent conversation. The conversation really doesn't have very strong guiding principles. Free speech. Like, okay, why though? I mean, free speech for itself? To what end are we defending free speech? And then we look at anti-white stuff. Well, it should be egalitarian. Should it be, well, are they being hypocritical? Is it about standards on social media? Are we talking about the fact that there's racial hatred, or the fact that Jack Dorsey won't take off that, but he'll take off other things off Twitter? And then in terms of demographic change, is that a good thing? Can we all live together? Should we lessen immigration? Should it be based on merit? All these conversations, compartmentalized, separate, isolated, are not really directed towards the right end. It's all kind of up in the air. It's all kind of arbitrary. You know, it's a matter of taste, really. But what do you prefer in terms of this? Do you think free speech should be more liberal? Do you think the state should come in? It's like my conversation with Lucian the other day. Well, could we have a couple of immigrants? Should we let the market sort it out? When you see this picture of what's happening, you know we can't wait for the market to settle it all out. You know that it's not a matter of free speech on college campuses so that we could defend the state of Israel. You know, that kind of shit. We see where the country's headed. We are given now a mission. We are given a directedness to our politics. It's not based on abstractions. Oh, we have to limit the size of the federal government. Or we have to ensure economic equity. Yeah, screw all of that. In 100 years, this is what the country's going to look like. You want to live in a country where you're in a minority, and on television, the history books, everywhere, they're saying you're responsible for everyone else's problems? I don't really care if we're socialist at that point. Sorry to say. I don't really care if Social Security's bankrupt at that point. Sorry, but if my children and grandchildren are going to be getting scalped and their eyes torn out and tortured and their land reclaimed by the government, yeah, I don't really care what economic system that happens under. I want to prevent that from happening. And so the word I've been using is a white holocaust. And the reason being, I think it is a white holocaust. This resonates with people because that's ultimately what we're heading towards. The systematic extermination of a certain people. Now, we don't know if that's totally the details of what happened before, but we look at a white holocaust and the writing's all on the wall. I mean, these people will say that any slight, any wrongdoing, whatever, they refer to Israel not having everything they want as a Holocaust, you know, that kind of thing. So it's a way to kind of reappropriate and co-opt that term to suit our own needs. It's to say, well, you know, I think we've kind of got the Jewish Holocaust covered. I think we all know not to go after Jewish people or else you get fired. Or then there'll be another Holocaust, I guess. You know, there's enough museums, there's enough awareness, enough classes about that. I think we're pretty good on that one. I think we're pretty safe. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But this white genocide that's going on, nobody's talking about it. If you do talk about it, people attack you. And so I think to transfer the word Holocaust over to it is a way to make it relatable to people and say, well, the same sort of thing that you saw leading up to the Holocaust, which we all know is a terrible thing that happened, we can bring it forward to today and say we're seeing the same signs. We're seeing the same warnings, the same buildup. Nobody's talking about it. And so that's what I've been referring to it as. And maybe then we'll motivate people. People say, well, Nick, you've said in the past that the Holocaust is only a tool used to shut white people up and that kind of thing. And I think that's true to a large extent. But let's take that rhetorical tool and use it for our own purposes and say, well, you know, if that's going to be the bludgeon where anytime there's a criticism of the status quo, we're going to say, Holocaust, Holocaust, it's happening again, you've got to shut up. We're going to turn that around and say, well, no, but it's really only happening to white people. If a black person is discriminated against, it's literally global news. The Iranian president is talking about Black Lives Matter, to give you an idea, right? Even if a black person's committing a crime and they get shot, it turns in, I mean, that's how far we've gone. Think we're okay on that front, you know, in terms of that kind of racism. Even if it's like, it turns out to be a hoax. Look at what happened with that Israeli guy who was responsible for over 1,000 anti-Semitic phone calls, and he was from Israel. And we never heard about it again, right? So the genocide, the Holocaust that's happening today is a white Holocaust. It's happening in South Africa right now. It is a Holocaust in South Africa, and it will visit our shores if we don't get our own house in order. So, and look, that's all factual. Nowhere in there did I, you know, is it my own theorizing? Is it my own doomsday prophecy or forecasting it? Nowhere in there was there a reference to like IQ or, you know, racial anything. It's mathematics, folks, and it's going to happen.